I want to remix a couple points that both Marjorie and Norman have made here that I think together are suggest an even darker picture than any of the individual vectors might suggest. So first, when we talk about the First Amendment, a lot of people reduce it to one or more of its components. The First Amendment has many different pieces. One of them is a right of the press. A reciprocal part of that is the right of the public to know what our government is doing. That's why freedom of the press is protected under the First Amendment. And this idea, Norman described it as a selective prosecution. It would be, I think, equally fair to describe it as a predatory prosecution, and a defensive prosecution aims to insulate a completely indefensible set of human rights abuses and a foreign policy that is a human rights abuse engine from long overdue public critique. I think it was 2019, it might have been 2018, the Washington Post, Norman described how what WikiLeaks and Julian Assange have done is the same journalistic function as a publisher like the Washington Post and the New York Times. And I love your point that those outlets don't have to fear this kind of result because those outlets practice stenography as often as they do investigative journalism. Bit of a digression here, but just to riff, Marjorie mentioned the New York Times revealing the NSA's warrantless wiretapping activities. This was back in 2005. The New York Times sat on that story for a year. They swung the 2004 election for George Bush because they refused to publish facts. And we, the people of the United States, have a right to know the facts about what our government is doing, how our resources are being used, how we are being subjected to, whether it's the surveillance apparatus of the NSA or drone strikes targeting U.S. civilians by the CIA, that's happened too, or the torture that Marjorie described. That there is a thousands-page long report compiled by the Senate at great cost and over years. No one's ever read it, though, because it remains secret. And the danger of secrecy as a gateway to insulate any number of downstream abuses. And just to tie the loop here, I think it was 2019 or 2018 that the Washington Post revealed that everything we've ever heard about supposed progress in the war in Afghanistan was a lie. How different might the public discussion of those issues be if those cables were in the public domain from the beginning instead of being released years after the fact? How different would our posture on energy policy and climate change be if facts that were known to decision makers at the time were known to the public as well? Secrecy begets death en masse. And the last thing I'll say here is, Marjorie was talking about the collateral murder video. We're talking at the moment about a prosecution of journalists and publishers to constrain information from being released to the public. The people that were killed in the collateral murder video were themselves journalists. This is a multi-dimensional attack on the press that is continuing today under the Biden administration. And if anybody watching this was concerned about the Trump administration and its serial violations of international human rights, or the Obama administrations, or the Bush administrations before that, or Clinton or Reagan, we could go on. This is an issue, an opportunity to change the direction, to make sure that we are putting transparency and human rights before and I love how Marjorie described the national security as the interests of the state to be secure from the critique of its citizens. And that's exactly something that none of us should be willing to accept.
Those are great points, and go to the matter of content and timing. I'm no lawyer, but there's the saying that you can find chiseled in some courthouses: justice delayed is justice denied. And it's also true of journalism. Napoleon said, it's not necessary to censor the news. It's sufficient to delay it until it no longer matters, by which he also meant, yes, it matters in hindsight, but not to affect the actual events. And I think it is a great point that the New York Times and these other mass media outlets are not reliable because often they will delay. And it's a great example about the more than 1 year delay about the illegal wiretapping program that the New York Times acceded to, because they explicitly said, Bill Keller, the head of the organization at the New York Times, said, well, we didn't want to affect history. We didn't want to reveal this information until George W. Bush effort for re-election had been completed when was that? At the end of his first term. They said, no, we don't want to publish this before the election. We're going to wait. I sat through a couple of weeks of the trial of the CIA whistleblower Jeffrey Sterling in federal court. And we had testimony, including from Condoleezza Rice herself, the Bush National Security Advisor, where she had called in people from the New York Times and said, don't publish this information. Your reporter, James Risen, is exposing a really screwed up CIA plot involving diagrams on nuclear weapons provided to the Iranian government, but we don't want you to publish it. And so the New York Times, the top New York, Washington editor for the Times, went back to the Times hierarchy, and they decided, no, we're not going to publish it. And indeed did not until Risen made clear he was going to publish it in a book. What had happened in the interim? Well, what happens in the interim in all of these cases? The public doesn't know. The government is able to get away with even more malfeasance, often more killing, and there's no consent to the government because people don't know what the hell is going on, and yet we're told we live in a democracy.
You know, the irony is that WikiLeaks, these revelations actually saved lives. People don't talk about this, but after WikiLeaks published evidence of Iraqi torture centers that the U.S. had established, the Iraqi government refused Obama's request to extend immunity in civil and criminal cases to U.S. forces that remained in Iraq. And so Obama was forced to pull troops out of Iraq. And 10 years later, according to Iraq body count, the war logs remain the only source of information regarding the many thousands of violent civilian deaths in Iraq between 2004 and 2009.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we're so self-important in this country, and there are so many things here that are violations of international law. And we sort of try to hold ourselves out as sort of like this beacon of democracy and like the keeper of the peace. And yet we are in violation of so many international laws and agreements, and nobody ever really talks about that. Like what is our obligation there? I mean, like, where are we really falling short? I mean, I mean, there's probably every treaty and agreement that we don't pay attention to. I mean, torture obviously is against, international law. We're drone bombing how many countries right now without any sort of declaration of war. So there's all these violations going on, and nobody ever talks about the international law aspect of this. Like, where do we fit into that?
Well, the grandmother of all treaties is the United Nations Charter, and the U.S. helped form the United Nations system in 1945 to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, and we are bound by the UN Charter. It's part of U.S. law under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution that says treaties shall be the supreme law of the land. And under the UN Charter, a country does not have the legal right to invade another country unless it has been attacked, unless it has been the subject of an armed attack. And yet Bush illegally invaded Afghanistan. People don't talk about that. They just assume that it was a just war and it's going on too long, etc. But it was an illegal war. The Iraq War was an illegal war. They lied us into that war. Iraq never attacked us or any of our allies. And the same with the countries, the 7 countries that Obama dropped drones on, also in violation of the UN Charter. Trump continued to attack other countries in violation of the UN Charter. And I think it was a month into his presidency that Joe Biden bombed Syria and Iraq, also illegal. And yet people don't talk about that. That is our law, and we need to be mindful of that, the rule of law.
On the subject of international law and the American role in it, I want to maybe sketch an arc, because there was a point in time about 70 years ago when, as Marjorie was describing, we were pivotal in establishing any notion of international law in the first place. There were international norms, but the international legal regime as we know it today, we fought and won a world war to establish it. And that paradigm, that set of institutions, greatest threat today is the United States of America, the arc of having gone in 70 years from fighting a world war to establish international human rights to then becoming, within just 3 generations, one of the world's foremost repeated systematic violators of those very same principles, should alarm any of us. And I think it's one that, when Norman talks about the lack of informed consent, that most Americans have no idea that we have gone from being the liberators of Europe to the progenitors of torture around the world. Our human rights abuses are cited by other countries as justification for their own practices that violate, again, international principles that we were once proud to have established in the world. And to, we keep coming back to torture and kind of like removing it from the analysis because they are somewhat separate discussions, this idea of suppressing the press versus torturing people. But, the reason I want to bring torture back into the discussion is that it's just the latest among any number of treaty obligations that we violate. The Convention Against Torture is not only unequivocal about the prohibition on torture, but we are also internationally obligated to prosecute any credible allegation of torture and investigate it all the way up the chain of the command. We violate that principle every damn day that the torture report remains suppressed and secret. It's not as if we tortured some folks, as President Obama said, and we're not going to look backward, we're going to look forward, now everything's fine. Every day that we don't investigate the people in the US government who continue to serve in some instances, responsible for these crimes, as a country, we are complicit in ongoing violations of international law. I just want to make sure that that lens is part.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.